I would like to welcome all of you at our session. I think that this is the most interesting session of the Moscow Urban Forum. It is dedicated to the serious economic and social contradiction between, on the one hand, a compact, beautiful city, and on the other hand, the affordability of housing in that city for all the citizens, no matter what's the social status, the income level, and other characteristics. Any city in the world faces this challenge, and all countries find different solutions to this issue. Today, we would like to discuss this issue and the approaches to resolve it in various foreign countries and cities. And we also want to consider the situation in our country, in Moscow, and in other big cities. And to make some conclusions, what are the best practices available when we speak about affordable housing in the cities? I haven't introduced myself. My name is Tatiana Polidi. I'm Executive Director of the Institute for Urban Economics. I'm going to quickly introduce our distinguished speakers. It is Hazem Galal, partner of PwC. It is Solam Velani, Senior Advisor for Housing and Economic Development of the New York City Mayor's Office. In New York, there is a very interesting program of incentives for affordable housing. They use various bonuses. I hope Sonam will speak about that. Manfred Kühne, head of the Urban Planning and Projects Directorate of Berlin. Berlin is one of the cities with the most developed commercial and non-commercial housing lending programs. He will speak about that. Then we have Claudio Scioli, Chief of Training and Capacity Development of UN Habitat. UN Habitat is a basic agency that creates and develops principles of affordable housing and also evaluates the affordability of housing. So Claudio will also speak here today. Then we have Sergei Lyovkin, head of the Department of Urban Development Policy of Moscow. It will be interesting to listen to his opinion about this issue. Then we have Mikhail Dmitriev, president of the Economic Partnership New Economic Growth. Mikhail is going to share an economic view on this problem. What are the economic obstacles to affordable housing, and on the other hand, what are the advantages provided by development of affordable housing in the city? And the last but not least, Tadashi Matsumoto, head of Unit for Sustainable Development and Global Relations of Cities, OECD. So I would first like to give the floor to Hazem Galal, partner of PwC. He's going to present the results of the research of the World Economic Forum about how to make affordable housing a reality in big cities. So you have the floor and you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. What I would like to do is share with you some of the highlights of this research that we launched last month. It's a collaboration between PwC and the World Economic Forum. And about 2 years ago, we thought housing is becoming really an issue, not only with respect to cities that are in the developing world, but also we've seen in cities like San Francisco, London, New York, that gradually the middle class, teachers, people who provide very essential services in the city are being squeezed out, and especially when, more and more, for example, in the Bay Area, high-tech entrepreneurs would come and disrupt the prices for the housing market. So we commissioned this joint research. We've actually consulted with a lot of cities and mayors and experts, and what I would, including, for example, Calgary, Bristol, and many others. And what I would like to do is share with you some of the highlights. The full report is actually on the World Economic Forum's website, and you can download it for more details. So if we were to analyze, the housing issue in a very comprehensive way, we need to look at it from two sides, the supply side and the demand side. And when we look at the supply side, we need to look at land acquisition and securing titles. We need to look at land use, zoning and regulation. We need to look at the funding element. We need to also look at the actual housing design and development costs. So by definition, it's a multidisciplinary issue that requires all of these components to come together. On the demand side, we have to look at how does a city determine eligibility. How do we evaluate the different purchase models to rent or to own, and also how to finance credit. This is how you can really fully analyze the whole issue. What are some of the cities doing about some of these supply and demand tensions? We're seeing a lot of policy elements and policy tools and examples where cities are starting to monitor using analytics. For example, in Melbourne and other cities like Paris, if the use of utilities like electricity and water is minimal or it doesn't exist over a certain period of the year, many months, that's a good indicator that this is a closed apartment. And if somehow the city is subsidizing a person to keep a unit of housing that is closed, then this is something that they need to address. In Saudi Arabia, they put, for example, something that they call the white land tax, where if you have a piece of land that hasn't been developed for many years, you start paying taxes, as a result, because what investors used to do is to keep the land so that it appreciates, but it's also depriving the city from possible housing stock and developments that it can do. And of course, many other examples exist. One of the issues that we have is, and this is an acronym, that I don't know how it would translate into Russian, but the NIMBism, not in my backyard. Everybody would agree we need affordable housing, for low middle class income, but when it comes to actual decisions on where to actually implement this in a city, everybody wants it in the city, but they don't want it in their own neighborhood. And sometimes that results in a lot of tensions in communities. We've seen what happened, in one of the New York boroughs with Amazon, I think it was, that wanted to move there. And the community resisted because they thought that would drive the affordability out of reach for many people of the community and will have other side effects. So what are some of the challenges, basically, that, these are supply side challenges. Let's look at, if the clicker would work, some of the criteria right now that are being used to determine eligibility on the demand side. There are two approaches, targeted approaches that some cities would use so that you're targeting a certain part of the society, be it based on income levels or any other criteria, and all of the housing programs would actually be addressed to this specific targeted sector of the community. And then there is a universal approach. In Singapore, which is an amazing example, first of all, 86% of the housing stock in Singapore is public housing. But you kind of like graduate from one criteria and one type of unit to the other as you go through your life, from a young couple going to a family to an elderly person and so forth. And along the way, it becomes a way that you can actually accumulate wealth, and it's a very complex system that they have established to look at the housing market. One of the other big issues that we looked at in terms of the trade-offs between home ownership to buy or to rent Each one of them has its own advantages and disadvantages in terms of, appreciation, but also the cost to own. One of the definitions, and there are many definitions of housing affordability, doesn't only look at the cost actually to acquire a unit or to rent it, but also what we call the total cost of ownership, which is the maintenance cost, the operating cost, so that you're able to keep it at the desired level, which in some countries actually is an issue, because once you buy or rent a unit, the level of maintenance provided by the landlords or the consortium of development is not what it really should be. So that's also a very important decision with some of the trade-offs that you see. If you're renting, you're subject to eviction if the policies are not strong. But on the other side, cities, for example, that have rent control, you, as a landlord, you might get stuck with one tenant without really having the rent adjust to what, a fair market price. So there are trade-offs for both sides. What are some of the recommendations that we came out in the report? We wanted to group up the recommendations by stakeholder. So the cities are a key element in this, and if you think about what are some of the supply side recommendations that cities need to do, a lot of it has actually, with the emphasis, having very clear property rights, having very clear ownership. In some parts of the world, you actually have the same property with multiple deeds because the bookkeeping and record keeping over the years hasn't been very accurate, and there are sometimes corruption and all of that. The cities should also, develop mixed-use areas, make sure that housing and affordable housing is always part of a medium to long-term plan so that they're always anticipating the growth of the city and so forth, and trying to adjust the housing stock accordingly in a proactive way and not in a reactive way. And then the incentives for developers. How do you actually create the right incentives for developers, maybe through a portfolio or some sort of like cross-subsidy modes that if you want to develop in the wealthy neighborhoods, you need also to be creating, parts of the city and addressing some of the affordable low to medium income housing. These are all different elements. And of course, we need to start working as a city more collaboratively with the construction industry to start bringing more innovation into the industry. This is one of the least innovative industries so far, even though the technology is there in terms of 3D printing and many other more advanced areas. From the private sector point of view, the investors need to actually embrace innovative techniques to finance land acquisition, securing titles and development. The financing becomes very important. Employers can also be part of the solution in terms of the provision of affordable housing and making sure that they provide those benefits and providing incentives for their employees to live closer to actually where they work, because part of the issue when the housing is far away from the areas where people work, we're creating another issue of mobility and all the externalities that come with that. And of course, the developers have a key role to do this in terms of their innovation, in terms of really working very closely with the government and the funding community to do that. Nonprofit sector in terms of, also has a role in terms of advocacy, in terms of trying to influence the right policies that are fair, that will also give everybody access to equal housing, and to also create the right balance between, what the developers would actually want in terms of a fair return and what the community needs in terms of affordable housing. And then finally, on the demand side, basically the city needs to create very transparent rules to determine eligibility and prioritize the beneficiaries in a fair way. And if you are subsidizing units, offering them below market costs, you really need to make sure that you have fair criteria, so only the people that qualify for this based on income or whatever other factors are the ones who are getting those benefits. In terms of the private sector, evaluation of purchase model, rent or own, we talked about this. And then finally, in terms of access to credit, this is very important important on the demand side. Many countries don't have the right vehicles like mortgage or any credit worthiness or any of these other tools that would allow people actually to buy and as a collateral and so forth. And this is especially important in the case of low to medium class income housing benefits. As I said, there's a lot more in the study, but I think I will stop here so that we are within the time. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. As Hazem noted it in his presentation, there is international experience, which is actually a huge variety of different tools for urban construction and housing policy. Can we switch your presentation on? What I would like to show you, that's two interesting slides which demonstrate a connection between this rigid urban building policy and the affordability of housing in Russian agglomerations compared to international agglomerations. My conclusion is very simple. If there are a lot of requirements to urban environment, if we want our cities to be compact, to minimize the negative environmental impact, as a rule, prices go up and housing affordability goes down. So we need to choose the priorities. Sometimes we have a softer urban policy and then the housing will be affordable, and vice versa. Just a couple of slides to show this survey regarding 17 regions of Russia. Those slides are available at the exit to this hall, and there's a couple of slides regarding the dynamics of housing affordability. That's the picture for the last 7 years compared to the foreign affordability. In Russia, there has been a positive trend. Housing became more affordable everywhere in Russia, starting from 2010. Here you can see this price-to-income ratio. You can see that in 2010 and in 2016, here are the numbers. Even in Moscow, where the prices are the least affordable, it is improving. The housing became affordable by 30% more affordable. The same picture is something that we see everywhere. What's the trend in developed foreign agglomerations? It's the reverse trend. Housing becomes less affordable. Prices get higher. Prices get higher faster than incomes. And you need to look for special tools. You can see London or New York or Singapore, and housing became less affordable everywhere. In Russia, according to our survey, this resulted from the nature of urban development. We can't say that our urban development is compact. Our urban policy is not really restrictive or tough. As our survey shows, we have a more liberal, softer urban construction policy. And it's very interesting to discuss this issue now, because as far as I know, the Western world is now turning around. Before that, the priority was the quality of cities, of living in a city. But the quality became very good, but the prices became too expensive. And now there is a dialogue. Which is more important to us, architecture, roads, and so on, or just housing affordability so that people have some place to live in? So how do we resolve this issue? Actually, it's a very cyclical issue that depends on the existing macroeconomic situation in any particular country. We will get back to that a bit later. We'll talk more about the Russian specificity, for example, in Moscow, about how Moscow is trying to resolve those issues. And now I would like to give the floor to Sonam Villani, the senior advisor to the deputy mayor for housing and economic development in New York. New York is a very interesting case for us. It's a metropolitan area and an agglomeration with very high prices and very low housing affordability. And however, I know that both urban and housing policy is very diverse. They tried different approaches to resolve this issue. So, Sunam, could you share your experience, the experience of New York, with us? How do you resolve this problem of affordability?
Great. Thank you very much. And it's very, very exciting to be here with all of you and, of course, my colleagues from around the world. So again, thank you to the government for hosting us and allowing us to share these ideas across cities. I actually wanted to start with Moscow and New York. So, just a minute ago, we were learning about Moscow's incredible rise, right, in terms of affordability. And I can say that New York is actually the opposite. Housing has gotten much, much more expensive, particularly over the past 10 to 12 years. And a lot of what we're trying to do is sort of reverse that, right, and follow Moscow's footsteps to some extent. I would say that these two cities have very different personalities, but over the past several decades, both have become much safer and much more prosperous than ever before. And as a result of this prosperity, we find ourselves needing to accommodate those who are moving here to pursue their dreams, whether it's to build a new Fortune 500 company or to pursue educational opportunities. And we want to, of course, make room for all of these new people, but also preserve housing for many, many people who've stayed here when times were not so great. And I think both of our cities have gone through those times, and how do we make sure that balance is there? And for us, that's not only a matter of fairness, but it's also a matter of equity. And it's what makes our city diverse and inclusive, and it's how we remain competitive when compared to Moscow, London, Paris, Tokyo, any of these other global financial capitals that are attracting the same level of talent. And we fundamentally believe that it's all about housing, because if we can't house people, nobody's going to move here, and thus our cities will not remain as prosperous as they have become. So in today's New York, I wanted to give you some context of what we are dealing with. You need to earn about $35 an hour to afford a market rate 2-bedroom apartment. And those are earning minimum wage, which in New York City as of last year is about $15 an hour. You need to work 107 hours to pay that rent. That means 15 hours a day, 7 days a week. And about over 50% of our rental households in New York City are rent burdened. And that means that they spend over 30% of their income on housing costs. In addition to that, over a third of our rental households spend more than 50% of their income on housing costs. And in part, that's a result of rising rents, of course, but it's also a result of the housing shortage. And a significant shortage, not just in New York, but in many American cities and many cities across the world. In New York, we have over 1 million households who earn less than 50% of what we term the area median income, which is about $52,000 for a family of 4. And if we let these trends persist, our economy, and I think one of my colleagues will talk about this, our economy will suffer, as will our culture. So today I want to offer you some of the lessons from New York City that may resonate with all of you, and also call on you to help us sort of figure out how do we future-proof our cities to accommodate new growth, but also balance the forces of housing affordability in the process. There we go. Okay. So that's my boss, Mayor de Blasio. And he stepped into office back in 2014, and we had a mandate to address this crisis in our city and create dynamic policies that reflected the changing market conditions. As you may recall, in 2001, New York City suffered from a massive terrorist attack. Investment levels went down, people started moving out of the city, and sort of that decade from 2001 to 2010, 11, we spent a lot of money trying to rebuild our economy. And we were very successful. That meant that new people came in, and then we got to a point where we couldn't accommodate more people. And that's when this mayor was elected, coming in with a progressive stance on how do we make this city much more affordable, not just on housing, but also on a number of other economic benefits, which I'm happy to talk about later. So in 2014, we sketched out our 10-year housing plan across our 5 boroughs, and we asked ourselves some key questions about affordability levels, incentives, demographics, rentals versus ownership, and preservation versus new construction. A lot of the things that Hazem mentioned in terms of what these consulting firms are looking at, we asked ourselves the same questions and then put it into action. And we came up with a plan, and these policy decisions are inherently politically charged and open to debate. And we had tons and tons of community outreach, and our plan then, sort of as you see on the slide, we decided to build or preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing over 10 years, a mix of preservation deals and new construction. And again, across a variety of income levels, because we need to provide housing not only for the lowest income individuals, but also for our teachers and firefighters and individuals who provide public services to our citizens who should not be priced out of the city, and who deserve as much a right to live there as anybody else. And we built this plan on a number of key principles on, again, preservation, new construction, creative zoning mechanisms, new technologies to build housing for all. And quickly, I'll go through a couple of our key principles that led us to this. The first was to address the city's changing demographics and expand the range of individuals we serve. In a fair housing market, as I mentioned, we need to meet all types of people working in all types of industries, not just people making millions of dollars in the finance industry, but everyone else too. And we also had to better align our incentives and our housing stock with our demographics. So for example, the number of people living in New York City over the age of 65 is projected to grow 40% in the next 20 years. However, we're still building large 2-bedroom apartments for families when we should be building much smaller units for individuals who are aging in place. Second, we wanted to consider the neighborhood and land use policies within those neighborhoods. And to become a more affordable city, we needed to become a denser city. So some of you may have been to New York. We have lots and lots of skyscrapers. We need more of them. But there's a lot of pushback often in some of the outer boroughs with regards to this density, because the density needs to come with smart infrastructure investments. New schools, new parks, open space, new transportation. So the city has dedicated $1 billion over the next 10 years for any area that we rezone for higher density. We will provide these requisite services before the growth happens rather than after. The third was economic diversity in every single one of our neighborhoods. And that's a cornerstone of our housing development, because we believe that mixed use neighborhoods and mixed income neighborhoods are what will help our city succeed in the future. So when we rezone any neighborhood or any large private site to unlock significant new housing capacity, we don't just encourage developers to build affordable housing, we actually require it. 20 to 30% of all units in new developments are required to be below market rate. And the city provides either tax incentives or zoning overrides or other mechanisms and tools to achieve that. Fourth, we use our municipal tools and public assets much more effectively than we used to. So whenever we subsidize a project, we make sure that we're not over-subsidizing it. And whenever we structure complex deals, we have to leverage every single source of funding to its fullest extent. So that means funding from the federal government, the state government, private financing is very, very important to all of this. Our plan is over $40 billion. About $8 billion of that is from the city government, and the rest of it is financed by the private sector. and creative financing programs and tax incentives, which we can talk about, to drive more housing production. In addition to that, earlier I talked that about 60% of our plan is focused on preservation and locking in affordability in neighborhoods. And New York City, over the past many decades, has spent billions and billions of dollars on housing affordability. About 1/3 of our total housing stock is rent controlled, which means some form of control that stops rents from going up too high. And for us, we cannot afford to lose these units to market pressures and weak rent protection or expiring regulatory agreements, and that's why we've given the same attention to designing and funding new programs to preserve existing housing as much as we are doing to build new housing. And again, I think one of the biggest tools that we have that we frankly do not use as often as we should is to leverage new technology in the construction process, right? There's only so much you can do to drive down the price of land, but there's a lot more you can do to drive down the actual cost of the building itself. And we've begun to roll out micro units. I personally like to refer to these as tiny homes in the Big Apple. New York City is often known as the Big Apple, and these are very small units within that big city. And it's high-tech design, high-tech apartments to maximize affordability in our highest density areas. And we support affordable housing actually also through modular development. So allowing units to be assembled or produced off-site in factories nearby and then driven to New York and literally put together like a Lego set so that saves both time and money in the long run. And those are some of the principles that we've already put into action, right? This is a city, it's a live plan. It's about 6 years into a 10-year plan. And we can definitely say that the plan is working, right? And this graph sort of proves my point. In 2017, we actually increased our goal from 200,000 units to 300,000 units over 10 years. And we are actually ahead of track on that. And this past year, we surpassed an all-time record for affordable housing production in New York City with over 32,000 units financed in a single year. And the majority of those reserved for lowest income families. So all to say, housing for us is in the best interest of every single resident. And no matter where you live or how much you earn, for us it's important to work together and to play a leading role in preserving and building more housing. As many of you can agree to, no one can work or play or learn or create or prosper without decent housing, and it's a fundamental human right. And that for us is very important for creating both an inclusive and an equitable city.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much. It was really very interesting. We've already heard this. 70% of housing is this rent housing, and 1/3 is controlled under rent control for those houses. And this is really very interesting because for Moscow, the situation is very different. We have a situation different from New York. In Russian cities, 90% of housing is condo, that's private property, flats. And we only have housing rent as the rent of some flats. Well, some families rent flats from others. And for now, we still have to develop a market of professional investment. Berlin is also a very interesting city from the point of view of progress that it has made in terms of different forms of housing rent. 90% of housing is used as a rent. So I believe it would be very interesting to hear from Berlin experience, and Manfred Thuner will tell us about that. You have 7 minutes, please, Mr. Manfred Thuner.
The invitation and this wonderful congress and discussion. Among people from Moscow and New York, I'm the small town boy. Berlin has only 3.7 million inhabitants. Before World War II, we had 1 million more. and I'm the representative of the lost paradise of affordability. Since the revolution of 1919, affordable housing was always a central national field of politics. And as a result, in the early 2000 years, Berlin had, for the first time in history, 100,000 empty apartments. And so in Berlin, it was always reasonable to rent a home and not to buy it because it was so much supported by the state. And you mentioned it already, we have more than 85% people who rent their homes. And now we are challenged by the first regular economic boom since the 1920s. And one reason for this boom is that for 2 decades, Berlin was the most affordable city in Europe. And many, many young, talented, well-educated people came to Berlin. They did find not job in a city of high unemployment, and they started their own businesses, and our trouble began. So since a few years, Berlin changed from the capital of unemployment to the capital of the city of the highest job increase in Germany, and we were completely unprepared. So we had to reactivate all instruments and all incentives we know in Germany. Germany has a tradition of high performance of public institutions in the housing market because we had 2 world wars and the division of the country, and all the political catastrophes made it necessary to interfere in the housing market. Today we have an increase of about 40,000 people every year in the city that need new apartments, and we are in the restart mode to activate all incentives and all regulation capacities we do have. When people from other German cities, big cities or European cities come to Berlin, they find the price level a joke in Berlin. Berliners were used to rent huge historic inner city apartments for €5.50 a square meter. But Berlin was also maybe the only capital in the world where the average income was lower than the national average. And so many people come to Berlin and they can afford the market prices. But for the local population, it's considered as a challenge because in Berlin, to spend more than 30% of your income is considered as unaffordable because we had this luxury situation and everybody was used to spend very few money for housing, and now that has to be changed. And so even more than the statistics shows, people, the electorate, is in a status of alert. We are happy that we reached in the last years a number of building permits that would allow to produce enough homes for the incoming new population. But we have the problem that there is a speculation market in Berlin. Many developers buy premises, start projects, but they don't start constructing. They sell and resell the projects, and that's a very new challenge for us. And so at the moment, we would need at least 20,000 new apartments a year. And last year we reached that number for the first time, but for many years we didn't reach it because of this market situation. I mentioned, what's that? Maybe I have to go one second. This sheet shows the increase of the affordable housing production. we are quite successful because we can learn from cities like Hamburg or Munich or Vienna who have this experience since a long time. And as we have heard from New York, we have regulation that in every regular housing investment, 30% of the investment have to focus affordable housing. And when city-owned housing companies are investing, they even have to produce 50% of affordable housing. But we have also the concern not to stabilize the social mixture of the city. And so maybe this is a really a limit in our strategies. So we encourage the market, we empower the city-owned housing companies. In the phase of the budget crisis in 2001, we learned that the city of Berlin was in a budget situation like Greece today. We had a complete sellout policy for 15 years. We sold half of the city-owned apartments. We sold every premise, every building that we had. And now we turned our policy to the opposite. We buy a lot, and we are restarting a strategic real estate policy to activate more and more premises to control the development. We also have a legislation that allows us to control quite efficiently investment in the existing housing stock. On the one hand, we can establish a special local status that allows to reduce the investment in rise the standard of the apartments in order to have a balance between investment and the final rent level. And we started with a system of rent break. It does mean we have a monitoring of the rent level everywhere in the city. And there is an instrument, literally translated, is called rental mirror. It means every tenant of an apartment can compare what is an acceptable price for the apartment, and the landlords are not allowed to increase the rent level beyond this fixed level. But anyway, the price level is increasing more and more. And so we are discussing even harder instruments. At the moment, our government is decided to start legislation to freeze the rent price level for 5 years. Nobody knows if this is today according to our constitution. We had that for many years after World War I and World War II. We have this tradition, but today there is a legal discussion if this is too much interference in the constitutional right of property. And so at the moment, we are in an escalation mode, and we have to get more experience if it's really necessary to interfere so heavily into the market, or if we could reach more by negotiation and negotiations and other agreements with the stakeholders in the market. Maybe that for the introduction.
Thank you very much. I have one brief question. I would like to ask it in English.
Have in Berlin, I mean in federal or municipal ownership, what share of housing stock is public?
Before the sellout policy, we had 100,000 city-owned apartments, and now we have the half. And we had a funding system in the 1970s and the 1980s that has, as a result, that in private-owned buildings, the rent control is running out by the time. So our construction activities for new affordable housing is meant to balance this number of about 100,000 rent-controlled apartments. But I mentioned already these other tools to moderate the increase in the private-owned housing stock.
Спасибо.
Thank you. I would now like to give the floor to a very respected international expert from UN Habitat, Claudio Ascioli. I hope that Claudio will focus once again on the importance of developing various forms of affordable housing, not just housing and property, but also subsidized housing, rented housing, individual housing, and so on and so forth, depending on the needs of the cities. Claudio, you have 7 minutes.
So, 5 things in 5 minutes one should know about housing. If that works, seems. What do we mean for housing? So it's more than bricks and mortars with a roof, and we're speaking about a very complex economic powerhouse where everything seems to connect with an institutional framework, legal and regulatory frameworks that in the end all connect to deliver housing that we call affordable or adequate housing. So we need to remind ourselves that when we're speaking about housing, we're talking about building materials, finance, land, infrastructure, all connecting, which makes housing the beauty because the economy is connected completely with the backwards and forward linkage. But for the United Nations, we're talking about the right to adequate housing, which means 7 dimensions of adequacy, and which one is affordability. So location, cultural adequacy, habitability, security of tenure. So in defining this is the right to live somewhere in peace, safety, and dignity with access to basic infrastructure in a location that allows adequate access to jobs and opportunities in urban service, all at an affordable price. So the issue of affordability is fundamental in the right to adequate housing, as is recognized in the international human rights framework that the Russian Federation, Brazil, the Netherlands all have. Some have ratified, others have recognized when they adopted the big agenda of development in the world. Now, we do have in the Sustainable Development Goal 11.1, the commitment of all member states, including Russia, Germany, and all the countries represented here, to provide affordable housing for all. So this is important. 2, making housing affordable is a policy decision to influence the supply and the demand side of the housing market. We need to understand that. My colleague in the beginning said, where do we go? Do we focus on the supply side, in which we want to decrease housing costs, the production costs, or do we focus on the demand side, increasing the ability to pay, the affordability of households in order that can afford what is offered in the market? Actually, many European countries have moved away from subsidies and focus on the supply and very much focusing on the demand side, increasing the ability of people to pay for housing, either for rent or for ownership. So there are many instruments and measures for that. It seems, yeah. So policies of different ways to create financial systems, property taxation, so land costs, labor costs, and on the other side, different income transfers, housing grants, tax relief, many ways to allow that the overall commitment of housing, household income, decrease to 25 to 30% of household income. So the issue is affordability. Now, 3, we face a global affordability crisis. and why I'm going to show you, the lack of affordable housing compels people to resort to informal housing solutions, which propels, in many parts of the world, informal urbanization and slum formation, and generates more exclusion and more poverty in cities and segregation. Now, how do we define affordability? We're talking about affordability. It's a comparison between house prices and household incomes. Areas rated as affordable housing price should not exceed 3 times the gross annual household earnings. That's the threshold we use in UN Habitat. And rent should not exceed 25% of household income. Exceeding those threshold, housing is considered unaffordable. So this is the global sample of cities, 200 cities. Well, there were like 4,650 cities above 100,000 inhabitants, and we select that defines the urban world, let's say, that concentrates where people live. And then we had these findings. Conclusion 1. We divided the cities, the 200 cities, by income, and as you can see, in all the cities, house price to income ratio is above 3, which means housing is unaffordable in 200 cities that we have in our sample, from the low income to high income cities. Then we went to rent, and guess what? There it is. The majority of the cities, people are committing more than 25% of their household income to rent. So where do they go? They live with their family long. Some countries we see more and more people, adults, young adults living with their parents because they cannot pay for housing. We see people living in rooftops, sub-renting, going to the street. We just saw in LA, there is more than 70,000 people living on the streets in LA. So homeless. Where do we go? Then we have the housing affordability survey done by Demographia. 309 different markets in 8 countries. And guess what? Most places, house price to income ratio above 3. So affordability, where people are coming. Why do we need a municipality like Berlin or a mayor like in New York in order to intervene with policies that make possible through inclusionary zoning or through mechanisms of subsidy to make housing affordable? Because we have a crisis there, and we need to recognize, because the way we finance housing, the way land delivery for urbanization actually defines the type of skyline, the form of cities that you will have in the outcome. Over and over, we're seeing that. 4, the lack of affordable housing, as I said in the beginning, leads to informal urbanization and growth of slum. And then we see situations like that. Apparently, the battery here is over. Yeah, I'm doing here. Okay, so we have this situation here where in the statistics, we're doing the measurement at the moment. So 1 out of 4 people living in urban areas live in slums. This is the reality. We're talking about nearly 1 billion people living in conditions of slums. And these are the cities we work. So they divide the cities, those who have and those who have not. And we associate the lack of affordable housing in a market leads people to opt to this kind of urbanization. Okay, in Russian cities, perhaps you don't have that scale, but more and more we see in the developed world people creating mechanisms to afford location and affordable housing. So rooftop development, sub-renting, a lot of practice because people want to be located to where they earn their income. 5. Promoting affordable housing options in cities means producing diversity and scale in size, standard, price, typology, in unlocking the service land supply, so dealing with policies that intervene in the private domain of land property and property domain. So many countries have and respect the individual property rights. So we need to have instruments to intervene in that right as well, so that we unlock the land supply, and having housing at the center of urban policies, which means housing is not an isolated thing, but is part and parcel of the way we think cities and urbanization. So 5 policies to bring housing to scale. So urban renewal, going hand in hand with housing at the center, which means we provide incentives, policies, intervention that we stimulate the construction of housing opportunities where housing already exists. So you're not producing new housing, but you're producing housing opportunities. And at the same time, you produce more housing and bringing housing back to the city center. So creating more densities, more diversity, social mix, and so on. 2, unlock land supply for housing. Service land supply at scale. If we do not solve this, forget it. We will not be able to have a skyline, a kind of city that we're looking for. 3, citywide slum upgrading and urban regeneration. In many places, we have large parts of urban population living really appalling conditions. So it's important that we do that with a number of incentives and interventions linking planning, infrastructure, investment, land location, and so on and so on. 4, unlocking the housing finance. It's very important that we make finance available. Most people think, oh, we need finance because we need to produce housing. But actually, the availability of finance stimulates the demand. Because if people have access to affordable credit and affordable mortgage, they actually start going out there to consume housing that they can afford. But if housing finance is underdeveloped, forget it. We're losing the war. And then 5, we need data and information. We need policies that are well-informed, well-designed, not based, well, I think, no. Evidences from data, from indicators, how markets are functioning, what is the ratio, house price to income in this city and that city. We need to stop thinking on guess. We need data and good data. So to finalize my story, I would like to say the following. In the 200 cities that we found, that the average is 55% of the land cover of cities is used for housing and residential use, meaning that 35% the lowest, 85% the maximum. What does it mean? It means that whatever we do in housing, we see this, the impact on the urban form, in the way the skyline, the density, the way people are living are incredibly influenced by the way we're dealing with housing. And finally, 2 cases that I show just very flying because my time is over. When we speak about housing at the center, let's look at Singapore. How did they do? They put 3 elements fundamental. Strong urban planning to make sure that land is planned for investing on housing. A national housing fund, the CPF, the Central Provident Fund, so solving the issue of access to funding, and the land supply for urbanization. In a certain moment of time in the history, they actually issued a compulsory land acquisition, which actually enabled the state to intervene in the private property domain of land and making land available for urbanization. In some parts of the world, land is public, so people, planners say, well, we don't have a problem, but we actually have a problem to unlock land. So then we have in Singapore this system, which is beautiful the way they did it. Why? They created a fund that is so powerful, compulsory contribution from employees and employers. So creating a fund that enable, in an institutional framework, the Housing Development Board to deliver very high quality and affordable housing. So you have situations like that. So it's high rise, high density, but very high quality of life. And what are the lenses? 4 lessons. Legal provision for land supply, the housing fund to guarantee housing finance, a strong link between urban planning, land allocation, housing development, and the promotion of the housing sector as a wealth generator. And here is the Netherlands, opposite, promoting social rental housing, creating a national spatial framework, so the issue of planning the land for receiving investments on housing, a national housing fund and a national guarantee fund to enable housing finance to be available, and then a very interesting housing act that created a private entity that funds for the public good. What is that? The housing associations, which are today the largest social entrepreneur in the world. Some years back, they had in asset 93 billion euro in asset. And this is very similar to Singapore, but looking at rental housing. So the Social Guarantee Fund creating access by the housing associations, then the central fund which grants or loan and creates the guarantee, and an entity that produces social housing for the public good. But the interesting thing is that they link housing with the neighborhood. It's not about the building, it's about the way the building relates to the rest of the environment, which means urban planning, neighborhood planning, so zooming down to the responsibilities of housing association with the quality of life in the neighborhoods. And the lessons are the legal provision, again, the government funding and guarantees, a self-regulated sector, so this housing association, and the promotion of the social rental sector to enable access to affordable housing. And here I end my story with the paradox for you to think, because we are in a part of the world where we see some of the, I would say, some poorest countries in the world, in this part of the world, where they have become nations of homeowners. But let's ask ourselves, why is it that the wealthiest nations in the world have large parts of their housing stock in rented occupations, and the poorest countries in the developing world as well have become nations of homeowners? How come? What a paradox. And I want you to think about this, because this might give us an interesting debate in the future. Thank you.
Да, это действительно очень интересный парадокс.
Indeed, it's really a very interesting paradox why developing and poor countries are nations of homeowners, while in the developed countries they rent houses. It's really a very interesting paradox. And Russia is an example of a house-owning nation. And we've seen criteria for affordable housing. The cost of standard housing should be less than 3 annual revenues of the family. And this criterion is done in 12 largest agglomerations of Russia with the population of more than 1 million people. So actually we are quite well-to-do as a nation. And now I would like to give the floor to Sergei Lovkin from the Department of Construction of Moscow. The Moscow agglomeration has been successful in terms of improving housing affordability, because housing has become more affordable in comparison to revenues. And right now there is a new urban policy in the city. That is a comprehensive renovation program developed by the city. It's being implemented in a centralized way in order to renew the housing stock and improve the living conditions for Muscovites. Sergei, how do you assess the prospects of Moscow in terms of further improvement of housing conditions for the citizens? Thank you. I will begin with a question and a joke, given that we are having a discussion about housing affordability, and there are some free seats here. There are not so many people here, so actually it seems that there is no issue of housing affordability for Muscovites. If there was such a problem, this room would be full of people. But indeed, as any big city, and this concerns mega cities, every big city is fighting for human capital. For a human being, the first priority is to eat and drink, and the second priority is to have a roof above your head. And we are no exception here, of course. We are doing our best to improve housing affordability. There was a number in the presentation, that's 5.9. That's the affordability index according to the government criteria. And according to the survey of Hazem and PricewaterhouseCoopers, our housing affordability is improving We're in the 7th place among 12 largest agglomerations of the world, such as Beijing, Tokyo, New York, Shanghai, and several other agglomerations. And this is really important for us. So it means that it's not ourselves who did this evaluation, it's international experts. And of course, housing rent is a very important element of affordability. It's pointless to buy everything. You don't need this. Many things have been said about it. I don't want to spend your time by mentioning mobility, job availability, and so on. And that's the global trend. Cities become more successful and economies develop more rapidly if the population is mobile, and we are moving in the same direction. As for special programs for building rent housing, thanks to investors, there are no such programs for now, but we've been doing something for the last 7 or 8 years. That is, we have rent. That means that there is secondary rent. People rent a flat from someone, and then there is secondary rent. And this is how this problem is resolved in Moscow. Of course, there is a renovation program which was launched 2 years ago. According to that program, we need to provide housing for 1 million people. And that's 15 million square meters of housing. We need to build about 20 million square meters, slightly more, and there will also be a refinancing program. We all understand that housing affordability is not only about the price of housing or the revenue of the household. It's also about the volume existing on the market. If there is enough market volume, then the prices will go down automatically. And we are having programs for social support regarding municipal housing. It is built from the federal budget, and we have some population categories such as war veterans, people with small children, and so on and so forth, people with many children. It's also an element of support. And the renovation program has a special decision according to which people who are getting housing have the possibility to buy several new square meters with a reduction of prices. There has been a special decree, and over these 2 years, we could see that 15% of people who move to another flat use this possibility. And the prices go down by 10%, and it's important, even 10% of the total flat price. We've also analyzed the housing market in the Moscow region, and we could see that the housing prices rise more slowly than the inflation rates, and that's also an important advantage for those who want to buy housing. The more a city is developed, the more comfortable and attractive and interesting it becomes. The more people there are who want to buy a city, not only within an agglomeration. Even other people want to move to this city, and this puts pressure on the market because the sellers can see the demand, they earn money, there is some policy behind it, but I'm quite confident, and I'm finishing with that the most important aspect of housing affordability is the mortgage rate. Some leading consulting companies, including PricewaterhouseCoopers, have analyzed the mortgage rates on the market, it's 5 to 5.5% on average, and this interest cap is comfortable for the buyers, and it improves the buying capacity and housing affordability. You know that the Russian Federation has launched some national projects. One of them is called Housing and a Comfortable Urban Environment until 2024. This program has been approved, and one of the goals there, approved by the President, is to decrease the annual rate to 8%. Right now it's 9.5 or 10%. So if it drops by 3.5 or 4%, the housing rate will be much more affordable. Thank you very much. Thank you. Indeed, Moscow, as a city which still has a high index of housing affordability, and if the interest rates go down and if mortgage rates go down, this could boost demand once again, because we could see that in other cities with pretty high housing affordability. So if mortgage rates go down, in other cities it will not provide more growth, but for Moscow it's really relevant. Mikhail, now I would like to ask you, rent housing, that's not the only an alternative to buying a house or a flat. It's also an investment for our cities. It's the possibility to create labor markets, and this will boost economic development in the country. Could you say a few words about it, please? With your permission, I don't want to discuss the rent housing market right now. I would like to talk about housing affordability for the middle class. And Claudia has already broached on this subject. And in the midterm, this topic has become more relevant for Russia, because Russia has set some ambitious goals in terms of housing introduction on the primary market. And it's also about demand and supply on the primary market. The formats of housing construction have changed recently, and this means that housing will become more expensive on the primary market by a quarter for those who will not take mortgage. Those who will have to use the mortgage format will have to pay twice as much. And the problem of this primary market is that these resources are not, this money is not part of the real sector. The financial sector gets this money, that is banks and those that guarantee that the housing will be commissioned and construction risks will be reduced, and this money will always stay in the financial sector. And this might result in some shock consequences. And that's why it's very difficult to really fulfill the targets of the national target project. We could actually limit the number of developers and retain only reputed developers in this sector. We could also ensure risks, because real risks are not so high for now. I'm talking about risks involving unfinished construction. It's less than 25%, less than 5% of the population's investment in this sector. So those risks could be insured. This is what banks do. But if we talk specifically about regions which will have the most dire consequences, in my opinion, Moscow and the Moscow region will have serious consequences. First of all, Moscow, because it accounts for more than 10% of housing commissioned in Russia, and that's a serious issue. The main issue for Moscow in the long term is that Moscow's agenda includes redevelopment of the old industrial belt at the distance of 3 to 5 kilometers from the historical center of Moscow. The density of housing is very low. It may be much higher, and this would reduce transport and infrastructure costs for those who live there. And there is a lot of public benefit behind it. But the issue that with the current shocking situation on the supply and demand market, commissioning possibilities will be more limited because this housing will be close to the center, it will be expensive, and when the old investment mechanisms cease to be available, that will stop the redevelopment of the old industrial zones, and the losers will be the investors and the city as a whole, because this housing will be built on the outskirts and there will be more transport costs.
What may be other solutions here if we take the housing construction? Here we need to have a broader look at the financial market as a whole. There is a significant part of citizens for whom mortgage is not a convenient tool because they are ready to postpone the purchase of housing for some time, for 5 or more years. They are ready to just make savings, taking into account that the return on their investment, the interest on their investment will be significant. But in the reality, it is rarely the case. In the current situation in the financial sector, the banking sector will really face a shortage of loan resources to finance all the development programs. The market of partial investment into the housing will amount to 1% of GDP. At the same time, we have some other priority national projects, and in these projects, several trillion rubles will be used to develop infrastructure, and these will mostly be financed by bank loans. We evaluated which resources of the big banks are available for these programs, and we understood that in 5 years the banking sector will not be able anymore to invest into long-term projects, and in that period the market of housing will face the lack of loan resources. And in order to overcome this situation, we need to take into account the following. So far, there are credit and loan resources provided for the whole cycle of living of the infrastructure. Usually in the world, loans are used only to build a facility, but then bonds are issued. But in our country, there are no potential buyers of bonds, although the yield of bonds is higher than inflation. And at the same time, the state guarantees need to be provided, as is the case on escrow accounts. That would allow the citizens to save more funds and to get a higher return on their savings. At the same time, we could change fiscal legislation in order to make the situation more comfortable for the individuals who act as investors and who purchase bonds. If there are individual housing accounts of citizens where they could make savings or purchase infrastructure obligations with infrastructure bonds with the state guarantees and get tax breaks, that would make the purchase of housing for them less expensive by 15 to 20% to compare with the escrow accounts mechanism. That would represent a real change in the situation, and that would help to compensate for the reduction of demand. And that would be more interesting than the current escrow accounts model. Thank you very much. And to conclude our session, I would like to give the floor to Tadashi Matsumoto from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And I would like to ask him to draw some conclusions based on our discussion as well. Tadashi, if you could fit into 5 minutes, that would be great. But 7 are also fine.
Okay, so now new role to conclude. But my slide was rather prepared for that, so it's good. So I like to present actually the paper that we are currently producing at the OECD, but the theme is exactly right to this discussion topic. And Tatiana, you started to say kind of trade-off between compactness and affordability. However, of course, policymaker wants to achieve the both things together, right? So our approach, of course, the OECD tries to find what are the better, more effective policies which creates compact urban development, but not compromising affordability. Vice versa, you provide housing affordability, however, without minimizing the impact to urban sprawl. So that's the issue. I need to skip these numbers, which are very interesting about comparison of the OECD countries about affordability, but people discuss a lot. Just one number saying in the OECD country average, if you look at the bottom percentile of so 25% of the income range, average is 40% of their incomes are being spent for rent and mortgages. Yeah, just I need to go quick this point, but we have a paper on that. So if you're interested, we can share. So this paper is trying to present or propose a policy assessment framework. So this is useful for city government or national government. So whenever you have a housing policy, in fact, in our study, we selected 17 types of housing policy, like mortgage deduction or direct supply of social housing and so on. So we have different types of housing policies. And we assess it through these two different lenses. One, of course, looking at compactness, yes? And then you see more compact, neutral, less compact. And then you see impact on inclusiveness. And then you also have 3 categories, increased inequality, uncertain or neutral, and reduced inequality. Then we assess if one policy's instruments affects positively both, compactness and inequality issue, then we say, okay, it's a traffic light simple approach, it says green, yes? And then if both are affecting negatively, of course, it's red. And then in between, there are a range of yellows because, it's really depends on the context or how you design the policy in the context. So that yellow is, of course, it's important. So, in fact, I wanted to go through this one, but I just tried to say red, where in fact it looks like orange. But so I like to challenge about this mortgage reduction. Yes. So one important point is that when you design the mortgage policy, often or most cases, it's not thinking about the location. Yes. Maybe housing quality, but it's not about where this housing is located. This is important. So we call it place blind policy. If housing mortgage policy is place blind, it creates always a negative impact on compactness because you have to choose a strategic location of housing, and you have to find a cheap location to get lower housing expense for mortgages. Then it has a strong impact on urban sprawl or urban expansion. So we say red. Also compared with rental policy, this was already discussed today, but if you compare how home ownership and rental, if it's the same levels of housing affordability, the difference is a mobility. Yes, so if you have a housing mortgages for a long time, it's not so easy to repay and find another place. If you have a job in different places, you want to move, but it's not easy to change your job because of the mortgage and the house. Rental housing, if it's the same levels of housing affordability, rental housing can provide a little better mobility to people. So mobility gives you a better opportunity for looking for a job which is more suitable for you, so you can be more mobile in terms of more opportunity to look for a job within the city, or also changing cities as well. So that's another thing. So we are trying to promote how to develop more effective rental housing policies. So this traffic light approach, if you have a chance to look at the paper will be published in a few months, but the key message is in the next slide. Key message is that yes, let's use fiscal policies more effectively. That's the first message. Second, try to unlock the potential of rental housing market by policy, but without damaging mobility, and also without having a sprawl. And then finally, this paper is for policymakers, so we need a strong institutional capacity, especially for national governments, to lead the discussion. Why housing affordability is important, that's easy, but why housing affordability together with compact urban development is more important. So national government has to develop a strong narrative on this, and the city government work together with national government to create this policy environment. Thank you very much.
Большое спасибо.
Thank you very much. Just one phrase to conclude. I think that we have had, on the one hand, consensus between foreign experts as well as between the Russian experts. Everyone agrees that it's important to enhance the affordability of housing, to create comfortable environment in the cities, not just for the purposes of economic growth and development, but also to enhance the quality of life and have the biggest social effects possible. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we've seen how important is the diversity of views on urban policy and on affordable housing. There is some difference between rented housing and mortgage housing. It all depends on a particular city and a particular country, and that is why we are organizing various discussions, including the discussion within the Moscow Urban Forum. It's not for the first time that we are discussing this agenda in order to exchange experience and implement the best practices. I wish all of us success. And first of all, Moscow, who is the organizer of this forum. Thank you for this interesting session.